On Father's Day, my son sent me a contract to sign. He thought he could trick me into giving up the one thing he'd been chasing for years. I didn't tear it up. I didn't argue. I signed it, and 3 weeks later, that signature ended his career, emptied his bank accounts, and left him with nothing but regret. It started the way most betrayals do, wrapped in something that looks like love. A week before Father's Day, he called me out of the blue. "Dad," he said, his voice warmer than it had been in months, "I've got something special for you this year. Can you come to my office next Sunday?" I remember smiling, thinking maybe the walls between us were finally coming down. We'd had our differences, sure, but I was still his father, and some part of me believed the bond we shared could never truly break. That Sunday, I put on my best jacket, the one I'd worn to his wedding, and drove into the city. His office was in one of those shiny glass towers, the kind that makes you feel small when you stand at the bottom looking up. I was greeted by his assistant, who offered me coffee and led me to a private conference room. A large leather folder sat on the table, neat and imposing. My son walked in moments later, all smiles and confidence, as if the whole world was in his pocket. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," he said, sliding the folder toward me. "This is going to make both our lives easier." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a rehearsed assurance, like a salesman closing a deal he'd been preparing for weeks. I opened the folder. It wasn't a card. It wasn't even a letter. It was a legal contract, several pages thick, written in language most people wouldn't bother to read. I scanned the first lines, and something in my stomach turned. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. If I signed this, I would no longer own the asset I had spent my entire life building. He would. I looked up at him. He just smiled wider, leaning back in his chair like he'd already won. I didn't show him the anger boiling under my skin. I just nodded slowly and decided, in that moment, that I would sign a contract, just not the one he thought. By the way, before I tell you exactly how I turned my son's trap into his downfall, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where in the world are you listening from right now. Before I tell you what happened after that day, you need to understand why my son thought he could pull this off in the first place. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It started years ago, long before there were contracts and legal jargon on the table. It started when I made the mistake so many fathers make, giving everything without asking for much in return. When my wife passed, my son was only 15. I became both parents overnight. I worked 2 jobs, one at the factory during the day, and another fixing cars in the evenings just to keep the house running and food on the table. Every time I looked at him, I told myself I was doing it so he could have a life without struggle. I'd come home bone-tired, grease under my nails, but I never complained. When he wanted the latest sneakers, I found a way. When the school trip came up and the fee was more than I could afford, I worked a weekend double shift. I didn't think of it as spoiling him. I thought of it as making sure he never felt the kind of lack I grew up with. The years passed, and my sacrifices turned into his stepping stones. He went to college without ever touching a student loan, because I'd saved every spare dollar for him. He drove a car I bought outright, so he wouldn't start his adult life in debt. And when he said he wanted to start a business, I didn't just wish him luck, I invested in him. Not as a partner, not as a shareholder, just as a father who believed his son's success was his own reward. At first, I thought he appreciated it. He'd call every week, thank me for the support, share updates about new deals and plans. But slowly, the tone shifted. The thank yous stopped. The updates turned into demands. The last time I asked about the company's numbers, he brushed me off and said, "Don't worry about it, Dad. It's my thing now." I let it go. I thought maybe he just wanted independence, but I see now that what he really wanted was control over everything I had, everything I'd built, and maybe even over me. That's why, when he handed me that folder on Father's Day, it wasn't just about business. It was a message. He thought I was finally weak enough, old enough, and tired enough to sign away my life's work without a fight. He thought wrong. The first time I noticed my son's greed, it was subtle, so subtle that I brushed it off as ambition. He was 21, fresh out of college, and I had just given him the seed money for his startup. We were having coffee one morning when he said, "You know, Dad, once the company takes off, I'll make sure you're taken care of for life." It sounded like a promise, but looking back, I realized it was more of a declaration, like I was already someone who needed taking care of. A few months later, he started calling me for small loans, 200 here, 500 there. He always had a good reason, a supplier who needed to be paid early, an unexpected expense for marketing. I never asked for repayment. That's what fathers do, right? They step in when their children stumble. But the stumbles became habits, and the habits became patterns. Then there was the dinner. We were at a family gathering when my cousin, a real estate broker, mentioned a prime piece of property coming up for sale. My son's eyes lit up immediately. "Dad should buy it," he said, laughing. "And I'll manage it for him." I laughed along. But later, my cousin told me in private that my son had called him the next day, not to help me buy the property, but to see if he could get the deal himself and put it in his own name. Another time, I caught him using my name to open doors with potential investors. He'd drop it casually. My father's been in business for decades to gain credibility. That part didn't bother me. What did bother me was hearing, through one of those same investors, that my son was claiming I was planning to hand over my entire portfolio to him as soon as he was ready. I'd never said any such thing. The greed was growing, but I told myself it was just youthful arrogance. I thought he'd mature, that once he achieved some success, he'd remember where he came from. Instead, the opposite happened. The more he had, the more he wanted, and the more he acted like everything I owned was already his by right. Looking back, all the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. But that Father's Day contract, that was the moment he stopped hinting and started taking. And he had no idea that in doing so, he'd handed me the rope he'd eventually hang himself with. It was the Wednesday before Father's Day when he called. I was in the garden trimming the hedges when my phone buzzed in my pocket. His name on the screen always brought a strange mix of emotions, pride, worry, and lately, a quiet undercurrent of caution. I answered, trying to sound upbeat. "Hey, son." "Dad," he said, his tone unusually warm. "I've got something special for you this year. Can you come to my office on Sunday, around noon?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to wonder what the catch was. "Your office?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, chuckling lightly. "Trust me, it'll be worth the trip." If I'd been smarter in that moment, I might have recognized the smug confidence in his voice. I might have remembered every time he'd said something would be worth it, and how it usually meant it would benefit him more than anyone else. But hope can make you forget a lot of things, so I said yes. That Sunday morning, I polished my shoes, put on the jacket from his wedding day, and even stopped to buy a small cake. I figured it would be nice to share a slice together, maybe talk like we used to. The city streets were quiet. When I drove in, sunlight bouncing off glass towers like they were made of gold. His building was one of those sleek, cold, all mirrors and steel. Inside, the air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and floor polish. His assistant greeted me with a practiced smile, offering me a cup before leading me to a conference room. The room was spacious but impersonal, the kind where deals worth millions were made without a single personal photograph on the walls. On the table sat a single leather folder. He arrived minutes later, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," he said, taking a seat across from me. His eyes had that same glint I'd seen when he was a boy about to pull a prank. Only now, it wasn't playful. It was calculated. He slid the folder toward me, his fingers lingering on the edge, as if savoring the moment. "This," he said with quiet pride, "is going to make things easier for both of us." In that instant, I felt something deep in my gut, not fear, not yet, but the faint tightening that comes when you know you're about to step into a room you can't easily walk out of. I pulled the folder closer, the leather warm from where his hands had rested. Inside, neatly clipped together, was a stack of papers thick enough to feel important. The first page had our names at the top in bold letters, the kind of formal print that makes you sit up a little straighter. I began reading, expecting maybe a partnership agreement or something to do with a joint investment, but the more my eyes moved down the page, the more I felt the air shift in the room. It was written in the kind of language most people avoid: paragraphs that twisted back on themselves, clauses buried under subclauses, and a tone that felt intentionally cold. At first glance, it looked harmless. Transfer of management responsibilities, streamlined asset oversight, simplification of estate handling. But buried in the middle of the second page was a sentence that turned my blood cold. It stated that, upon signing, I would be relinquishing all ownership rights to a particular set of assets that weren't named outright on that page, but were defined later in an attached schedule. I flipped to it. There it was, in black ink, the company I had built from the ground up, the properties I'd invested in over decades, even the small vacation cabin my late wife and I used to escape to. All of it. Son, I said slowly, what exactly is this? He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It's just to make things smoother, Dad, so you don't have to deal with all the headaches. I'll manage everything for you. Keep it in the family. You can relax. The way he said relax sounded more like step aside. I could almost hear the unspoken ending, and let me take over. You could have told me about this beforehand, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It's just paperwork, he said with a shrug. Standard stuff. We can sign it now and have lunch after. I've got a reservation. He slid a pen across the table. The metal clicked against the wood, a sharp sound in the quiet room. I looked at the pen, then at him. He thought he'd caught me off guard, and in a way, he had. But I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the quickest way to win is to let the other person think they've already beaten you. I picked up the pen, twirling it slowly between my fingers, as if I were thinking about where to sign. In truth, I was buying seconds long enough to read him, long enough to replay every sentence I'd just skimmed in that document. My instincts were screaming at me, the same instincts that had kept me alive in business deals where one wrong signature could cost a man his home. The problem wasn't just what the paper said. It was what it didn't say. There were no provisions for my input, no clauses protecting my rights if something went wrong, no safeguards to reverse the transfer. It was a one-way street, straight into his hands. Once I signed, I would have nothing left but whatever allowance he decided I needed. And knowing him lately, that allowance might not even be enough to pay for the roof over my head. I set the pen down gently and leaned back. It's a lot to take in, I said, keeping my tone casual. He gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think you're being overly cautious. Dad, you don't have to read the whole thing. That's what lawyers are for. Do you have a copy I can take home? I asked, tilting my head. His smile faltered just slightly. I'd rather we get it done today. No sense dragging it out. And there it was, the push. I'd seen it before in men who were about to close a bad deal, the urgency that's less about efficiency and more about making sure you don't have time to think. I get it, I said slowly, standing up as though I'd come to a decision. But humor me. Let me take a night to read through it properly. After all, it's my Father's Day gift, right? Shouldn't I savor it? He gave me a look I couldn't quite read, part irritation, part calculation, but finally nodded. Fine, tomorrow then. We shook hands, and I tucked the folder under my arm. He probably thought he'd still get what he wanted, that my reluctance was just an old man's stubbornness. He didn't know that by agreeing to let me walk out with that document, he'd just given me everything I needed to turn his plan against him. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder, sharper. I already knew exactly who I was calling next. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I took the long way out of the city, past the quiet suburbs, and into the kind of back roads where you can think without anyone breathing down your neck. The folder sat in the passenger seat, the leather cover glinting in the sunlight every time I turned a corner. To him, it was the key to taking everything I had. To me, it was an open map, showing every weakness in his plan. You see, what my son had forgotten, or maybe never really understood, was that I wasn't just a man with a few assets and a fading bank account. I was the majority shareholder in his company. Not because I demanded it, but because when he'd started out, no bank wanted to back a 20-something with nothing but a dream and a cheap suit. I'd signed the checks that kept his business alive in the early years, and in return, I'd quietly taken the shares no one else wanted. I never flaunted it, never interfered. I let him run the show. But legally, the company he bragged about was just as much mine as it was his. And that wasn't the only card I held. The properties listed in his contract, every one of them was tied to me in ways he clearly didn't understand. Some were owned outright, some were in trusts he had no control over, and one, the jewel in the crown, was jointly held with a partner who would never, under any circumstances, approve a transfer to my son. As the miles rolled under my tires, I thought about all the times I'd let him get away with things. Small lies, little acts of disrespect. Maybe I'd convinced myself it was better to avoid conflict. Maybe I'd been afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose whatever relationship we still had. But as I glanced at the folder again, I realized something: the son I was protecting wasn't the man sitting in that office today. That man was a stranger, and strangers don't get to take what you've spent your life building. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan was already forming. Step 1, call my lawyer. Step 2, make sure that when I signed a contract, it would be one that left me stronger, and him with nothing but a pen in his hand and a look he'd never forget. I didn't even take my shoes off when I got home. The moment I stepped inside, I tossed my keys on the counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before I heard the deep, steady voice on the other end. Henry's office. "It's me," I said. "I need to see you. Today." Henry had been my lawyer for over 30 years. He'd handled everything from property disputes to business contracts, and more importantly, he'd been a friend long before he ever took a dime from me. There was a pause, then a knowing tone in his voice. "Bring whatever's bothering you. I'll clear my afternoon." An hour later, I was in his office, sitting across from him while he flipped through the folder my son had given me, his eyebrows knit together tighter with each page he turned. By the time he set it down, the silence was heavy. "This isn't a Father's Day gift," he said flatly. "This is a full transfer of ownership." "I figured as much," I replied. "What else?" He tapped the second page with his pen. "Hear this clause. It's written so that once you sign, you have no legal standing to reverse the decision, no matter what happens afterward. And here, in the appendix, he's not just after the company. He wants the properties, the patents, even the offshore account. It's everything." I leaned back in my chair, letting his words settle. "So, it's as bad as I thought." "Worse," Henry said. "It's clever. He's banking on you trusting him enough not to read between the lines. And if you had signed today, by Monday morning, you'd be a guest in your own life." A slow smile formed on my face. "Then I suppose it's good I walked out with it instead." Henry raised an eyebrow. "You've got something in mind." "I do," I said, "and I'll need your help drafting something in return. Something that looks enough like this to pass under his nose, but with a few adjustments." His eyes lit up in the way they do when the game shifts in your favor. "You're thinking a counter-contract." "Exactly," I replied. "If he wants to play legal games, we'll play. But by the time he realizes what he's signed, it'll be too late." Henry nodded slowly. "All right, let's write the kind of Father's Day gift he'll never forget." Henry pushed the original contract aside and pulled out a fresh legal pad. The faint scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room for a moment. "First," he said, "we mimic his format, same number of pages, same headings, even the same font. He needs to think he's looking at the document he wrote." I nodded. "If he suspects anything before signing, it's over." "Right. So, we keep the first page almost identical. The first couple of paragraphs will look like they're transferring ownership to him. But buried in the middle, we reverse it. The signatures will actually grant you expanded authority. Instead of handing him control, you'll gain legal rights over his shares, plus a clause that makes your approval mandatory for any major transaction." I could almost see my son's face when he realized. "Make it airtight, Henry. I don't want him finding a single thread to pull on later." Henry's pen moved faster now, each line deliberate. "We'll also add a confidentiality clause. Once he signs, he's bound to secrecy. If he tries to fight it publicly, he'll be in breach, and that gives us leverage to freeze his assets while the case plays out." I let out a slow breath. "Good. What about the properties?" "They stay exactly where they are," Henry said, flipping through the original for reference. "But in our version, you gain the right to reclaim any property he currently occupies if it's tied to company funds. Which means, if I'm not mistaken, his penthouse and that vacation villa will both revert to you." A faint smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "He's been bragging about that villa for months." Henry looked up, a sharp glint in his eyes. "Then it'll be poetic justice." We spent the next 2 hours crafting the perfect mirror image of his own trap. Every phrase was chosen to look harmless to someone eager for control but deadly once the reality set in. By the time Henry printed the final draft, it looked indistinguishable from the original, right down to the position of the staple. I held the papers in my hands, feeling the weight of them. He wanted me to sign away my life. Now, I'll give him something to sign that'll change his. Henry leaned back, satisfied. All that's left is getting him to put his name on it. I stood, sliding the folder into my briefcase. "Leave that to me." I knew one thing about my son: his ego was his weakest point. If you made him feel like the smartest man in the room, he'd stop looking for traps. So, the next morning I called him. "Son," I said, making my voice sound hesitant, almost tired, "I read through the contract last night. I think you're right. It's time I handed things over." There was a pause on the line, followed by that smug little chuckle I'd grown to hate. "I knew you'd see it my way, Dad. You're making the smart move. I just need one small change," I added quickly. "Something about clarifying the management terms so I don't get calls from vendors or employees. I'll have my lawyer put it in writing. Just a formality." He didn't even hesitate. Fine. Bring it to my office. We'll sign it tomorrow." The hook was set. That night, I called Henry and told him we were on. We prepared a clean, crisp copy of the counter contract and placed it in the same leather folder my son had given me. From the outside, it was a perfect match. If he compared them side by side, he wouldn't see a difference without reading carefully, and I knew he wouldn't. To make it even more convincing, I added a handwritten note on top. "Let's make this official, Dad." I knew he'd see that as submission, a father finally conceding to his son's better judgment. The next day, I arrived at his office 5 minutes early. His assistant offered coffee, which I accepted, using the time to glance casually around the room. His desk was cluttered with real estate brochures, company reports, and what looked like a new vacation itinerary. He was already spending money he hadn't even taken yet. When he walked in, he was all confidence, tailored suit, gold cufflinks, that easy swagger of a man who believed the game was already won. "So," he said, sliding into his chair, "you ready to make it official?" I placed the leather folder in front of him and opened it just enough for him to see the first page. "All ready," I said with a faint smile. "Just sign where it's marked, and we'll be done." He didn't read it. He didn't even skim. He picked up the pen, scrawled his signature on every line, and handed it back without a second thought. "Congratulations," I said softly. "You just made the smartest mistake of your life." He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, tapping the pen lightly against the desk as if he'd just closed a deal that would make headlines. I slid the papers back into the folder, careful not to let the smirk tugging at my lips show. In his mind, this was already done, the kingdom transferred, the crown placed firmly on his head. "Glad we could do this face to face," he said, standing and straightening his jacket. "Makes it feel more official." I nodded, tucking the folder under my arm. "Yes, official." He walked around the desk and clapped a hand on my shoulder, the way a boss might to a retiring employee. "You're going to thank me for this, Dad. You won't have to worry about a thing anymore. I'll handle it all." "Oh, I'm sure you will," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. As we stepped out of his office into the corridor, he waved to his assistant. "We're done here." Dad signed the transfer. She smiled politely, not knowing she'd just witnessed the moment her boss signed away his own power. The elevator ride down was silent, except for the soft hum of the cables. He stared at his reflection in the mirrored walls, straightening his tie. I caught his eyes in the glass for a brief second, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely calm in his presence, because I knew something he didn't. When the doors opened to the lobby, he shook my hand with a firm grip, the kind reserved for men sealing a profitable deal. "We'll celebrate soon," he said. I nodded again and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. My car was parked right at the curb. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the building, all glass and steel, shining like it was untouchable. But I knew that within days, that shine would start to fade for him. On the way home, I called Henry. He signed, I said simply. "Perfect," Henry replied. "Then it's time to file the changes with the registrar. By the time he tries to use that contract, the system will already recognize the new ownership structure." "Good," I said, my fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "Let's make sure the first time he hears about it is when it's far too late to undo." 2 days passed before my phone rang. His number flashed on the screen, and I almost didn't answer, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted him to stew a little longer. Still, curiosity got the better of me. "Dad," he said, his voice sharper than usual, "I just sent the contract to my legal team, and they're saying there's a problem." I kept my tone flat. "Oh? What kind of problem?" "They're saying some of the language doesn't match what we agreed on. Something about additional oversight, clauses about property control. They're acting like you still have decision-making rights." I let a small pause hang in the air, just long enough for him to feel it. Well, I told you I wanted to add one small change. One small change? His voice was rising now, the charm gone. Dad, they're saying this thing gives you control over my shares. I'm just reading what I signed, I said, feigning mild confusion. That's what's in front of me. You had the chance to read it too. There was silence on the other end, not the comfortable kind, but the kind where someone's mind is racing so fast they forget to speak. You tricked me, he finally said. I gave you paperwork, I replied evenly. You asked me to sign something I did. You didn't read it. That's not my fault. He cursed under his breath, then tried to regain composure. This won't hold. I'll get it thrown out. You can try, I said, but my lawyer filed it with the registrar yesterday morning. It's official. Every change is already in effect. The silence returned, heavier this time. I could almost hear the realization settling on him like wet cement, slow, cold, and impossible to shake off. I need to call you back, he muttered, and hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a long moment after the call ended, staring at the phone. This was just the first crack. Soon the whole structure he'd built, the power, the pride, the image would start to crumble. And the best part? I wouldn't have to lift a finger. The documents he'd signed would do the work for me. I picked up the phone again, dialing Henry. He's starting to realize, I said. Henry's laugh was low and satisfied. Good. That means it's time to watch him try to wriggle his way out and fail. It didn't take long. By the next morning, I received a call from one of his board members, a man I'd known long before my son ever stepped into a suit. Thought you should know, he said, his voice tinged with amusement. Your boy's been stomping around here all morning. He called an emergency meeting, waving that contract around like a flag. Didn't go the way he thought it would. I leaned back in my chair. How so? He tried to announce himself as the sole controller of the company. Then one of our attorneys read the updated filing. The look on his face. The man chuckled. Let's just say he's not the boss here anymore. According to this, you hold 65% voting power now. He can't make a single move without you. I thanked him and hung up, letting the words sink in. 65%. Henry had made sure it was airtight, more than just control. It was dominance. My son had signed away the very thing he thought he was stealing. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, it was him. No charm, no arrogance, just a clipped, almost panicked tone. Dad, we need to talk. Now. I didn't rush. I let him stew for 2 hours before agreeing to meet at his office. When I walked in, the room was tense. Papers were scattered across his desk, and his jacket was draped carelessly over the back of a chair. He looked like a man who'd been through a storm he didn't see coming. You set me up, he said, his eyes narrowed. No, I corrected him, taking a seat. You set yourself up. I just gave you the pen. His jaw tightened. Do you have any idea what this means for me? I can't sign contracts. I can't approve budgets. Nothing moves without your say-so. I know exactly what it means, I said calmly. It means you'll think twice before trying to trick me again. It means you'll start remembering who built the foundation you're standing on. For a moment, he didn't speak, just stared at me, the realization fully settling in. Then he sat back, exhaling slowly, not in surrender, but in the grim acceptance of someone who knew the game had changed for good. This isn't over, he muttered. Oh, it is, I said, standing. You just haven't accepted it yet. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of that meeting, whispers started moving through the company's corridors. Word had gotten out, not the full story, but enough to set tongues wagging. Employees noticed the sudden shift in decision-making, contracts being rerouted to my desk, budget approvals coming only from my signature. It didn't take long for the press to catch a whiff of it. A small business column ran a story with the headline, Leadership Restructure, at Weston Holdings Founder Regains Majority Control. They didn't mention the details, but anyone who read between the lines could tell something had gone wrong for my son. Calls from his so-called friends began to slow. A week earlier, they'd been eager to be seen at his side, to toast with him at expensive bars, to post pictures of their business dinners online. Now, they were conveniently unavailable, too busy to return his calls. Business partners who once jumped to take meetings with him started asking to speak with me instead. I knew it was eating at him. His pride had always been tied to being the center of attention, the man people sought out. Now, every request, every deal, every handshake had to pass through me first, and I wasn't rushing to approve anything. One afternoon, Henry called me with an update. Just so you know, the clause we put in about asset-linked properties is already in play. The company accountant sent me records that penthouse he loves so much, paid for with corporate funds. A slow smile formed on my face. Which means, Henry said, it reverts to you within 30 days unless you choose to transfer it back. Same goes for the villa. I thanked him and hung up, picturing the moment my son would get that news. This wasn't just about the company anymore, it was about his lifestyle, the image he'd built, the very things he flaunted as proof of his success. All of it was about to vanish. And the best part? I didn't have to say a single public word. The documents he signed were speaking for me, dismantling his empire one clause at a time. By the second week, the mask was slipping. I could see it in the way he spoke to me on the rare occasions he called clipped sentences, forced politeness, the kind of tone you use when you need something from someone you don't like. It started with small requests. Dad, can you sign off on this vendor payment? It's time sensitive. Or, I need your approval for a marketing campaign. It's already in motion. I didn't say no outright. I just took my time. I read every line, asked every question, sent every document back for clarification. Deals that used to be wrapped up in a day stretched into weeks, and every delay chipped away at his confidence. Then came the bigger cracks. A supplier he'd dealt with for years pulled out of a contract, saying they preferred the new stability under my majority control. A bank he'd been courting for expansion funding told him they wanted to review the company's leadership before making any commitments. The whispers in the industry were getting louder. Maybe he wasn't the man to lead after all. I heard from Henry again. The villa's transfer paperwork is ready, he said. Once we file it, the keys are yours. I almost felt a twinge of guilt. Almost. But then I remembered the leather folder, the smug smile, the casual way he'd slid that pen toward me like I was already out of the picture. That thought erased any hesitation. It must have been the same day that he showed up at my house unannounced. No suit this time, just a polo shirt, rumpled jeans, and an expression that was more tired than arrogant. He didn't even wait for me to invite him in. Dad, he started, pacing in my foyer. This whole thing is getting out of hand. People are talking. Deals are falling apart. I'm losing control here. I folded my arms. You're not losing control, son. You already lost it, the day you put that pen to paper. He stopped pacing, looked at me with something between anger and desperation. We can undo it. Just tell your lawyer to reverse it, please. I shook my head slowly. You asked me to sign something that would have taken everything from me. All I did was make sure it took everything from you instead. His jaw clenched. So that's it? You're just going to watch me sink? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence said it all. Over the next month, the unraveling was impossible for him to hide. What began as quiet whispers in boardrooms had turned into open conversations in the industry. People didn't just suspect something had changed, they knew. And in business, once the scent of weakness is in the air, the predators circle fast. Clients began shifting their accounts elsewhere, citing concerns over leadership. Investors who once fawned over him suddenly became unresponsive, or worse, redirected their calls to me. He was no longer the golden boy. He was the man who'd lost his own company to his father, and everyone wanted to know how. I didn't feed the gossip. I didn't have to. The truth was there in public filings for anyone who cared to look. My name, listed clearly as majority shareholder and controlling authority. The same name that used to be little more than a formality in his presentations, now at the center of every decision. Then came the personal hits. The villa transfer went through without a hitch. I didn't even need to be there. Henry handled the whole thing. The penthouse paperwork followed a week later. When the notice was delivered, I imagine it was the first time in years he'd been on the receiving end of a lock change. I heard through one of the board members that he'd moved into a rented apartment, smaller than the space he'd once used for his office lounge. The image he'd cultivated so carefully, the luxury, the travel, the exclusive parties collapsed overnight. Without the company footing the bills and without control over the accounts, his lifestyle was reduced to what his personal savings could handle, and those I knew were not as substantial as he'd like to pretend. He tried to rally support, called in favors, tried to paint me as an overbearing father who'd swooped in to steal what was his. But every time someone looked into the facts, they found the signed documents, his signature on every page. I didn't need to defend myself. His own arrogance had done the job for me. One evening, Henry called. "It's done," he said simply. "All the transitions are finalized. Legally, there's nothing he can do now without your blessing." I stood in my study, looking out at the darkening sky, and thought about how quickly power can slip away when you think you're untouchable. He'd wanted me to vanish quietly from the stage. Instead, he'd written me back into the spotlight and himself out of the story. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when he showed up again, unannounced. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I heard his car door slam outside. The knock on the door wasn't the polite, tentative kind. It was sharp, impatient. I opened it to find him standing there in a plain jacket, no watch, no cufflinks, none of the trappings he used to wear like armor. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than a lack of sleep. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He went straight to the armchair by the fireplace, the same one he used to curl up in as a boy when the weather was bad. For a moment, I saw a flicker of that boy, but it vanished when he started speaking. "I can't operate like this," he said, leaning forward. "Every deal, every expense, every move, I have to run it past you. The people who used to take my calls are going to you now. It's humiliating." I took a slow sip of coffee. "You mean it's humbling, and maybe that's overdue." He scowled. "You think this is teaching me a lesson? All it's doing is ruining everything I built." I set my cup down and met his gaze. "What you built was standing on the foundation I laid. You might have added the glass and steel. But without the brick and mortar underneath, it all comes crashing down. And you tried to take that from me not by asking, not by earning it, but by tricking me." He shifted in his seat. "I was trying to secure the future." "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to secure your future, at the expense of mine, and you thought I'd be too old, too trusting to see it." There was a long silence, the kind where words hang in the air, unspoken but understood. Finally, he looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter. "I underestimated you." I stood, picking up my cup again. "That's the only thing you've said today that I agree with." He rose, nodded once, and left without another word. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading on the porch, wondering if this was the first step toward him learning, or the last step before he walked away for good. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, and the last of the evening light fading into the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere in the distance. My coffee had long gone cold, but I kept the cup in my hands, more for the comfort of it than anything else.